Did you know that the New Testament teaches tithing? I'm going to show you that the Apostle Paul told the Corinthian church to tithe. That surprises a lot of people because I hear a lot of people say, no, tithing's been abolished because tithing was given to the Levites and the Levites no longer exist and therefore tithing no longer exists. Well, the Levites don't exist anymore, but that doesn't mean tithing doesn't exist. And I'm going to show it to you right out of your own Bible that tithing is the New Testament. Let's first of all take a look at tithing in the Old Testament to find out why were the Israelites told to tithe and why were they told to tithe to the Levites. And here's the reason. Leviticus chapter 18 verse 21, and here it is. I give to the Levites all the tithes in Israel as their inheritance in return for the work they do while serving at the tent of meeting. The reason why God commanded Israel to give a tithe to the Levites is because their job was solely to be ministers. And they were to minister in the tent of meeting and minister to the Israelites. They were the minister of the 12 tribes of Israel. And they were not allowed to work farming. They weren't to be ranchers. They weren't to be carpenters. Their only job was to be a minister. So I want you to understand the first reason, and basically the basic reason for tithing to the Levites was for them to have a support for their living. This was their career, if we can say it that way. He re-emphasizes this in verse 24. Instead, I give to the Levites as their inheritance the tithes that the Israelites present as an offering to the Lord. So he again re-emphasizes that in lieu of their normal jobs that you all have, they're going to serve as ministers and you are to tithe to them. Okay, any problem so far? No, we all agree on that. Now let's get to the New Testament. 1 Corinthians chapter 9. Listen to what Paul says in verse 13. Don't you know that those who serve in the temple get their food from the temple, and that those who serve at the altar share in what is offered on the altar? There Paul is showing in the Old Testament, don't you know that the Levites, they lived off the tithe of the people because they were ministers of the old covenant. He says, do you understand that? Yes. But watch what he says. Verse 14. In the same way. Can I hear you all say in the same way? In the same way, the Lord has commanded that those who preach the gospel should receive their living from the gospel. He's saying ministers' career is to minister. And because they are full-time ministers, just like the Levites received the tithe, God's commanded that in that same way, they should receive the living in the same way as the Levites. So what does the Apostle Paul do? He says, just as the tithe was given to the Levite priests because they served as ministers, God now has commanded that those tithes shift from the Levites to those who are preaching the gospel full time. So when people say tithing is not in the New Testament, are you saying that there's no ministers serving full time in the New Testament? I'm one. That's all I do is I minister. I don't do anything else. I don't have a job outside of the ministry. This is my only job. Are you saying there's not ministers who serve full time? And in other words, the ministers are a reality of the Levites, which are the shadow. And Paul is showing that's where the tithe goes. And to this day, I have not heard one anti-tither be able to explain that. Explain that phrase in the same way. No, you can't explain it. All I hear people do is they tell me verse 15, but I have not used any of these rights. So Paul does say, I have not used any of these rights in getting the tithe from you guys. I haven't used it. But here's my point. He calls it a right. Did you know it is the right of your pastor to receive your tithe? It's his right. Now, I've had people tell me, well, why don't you be like the Apostle Paul, don't use your rights? Listen to what Paul says in 2 Corinthians chapter 11 concerning this. Watch this. He's writing to the same church, 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 7. Was it a sin for me to lower myself in order to elevate you by preaching the gospel of God to you free of charge? Was it a sin? Watch what he says. This is verse 8. I robbed other churches by receiving support from them so as to serve you. How many of y'all know robbing is a sin? You know what he's saying? Was it a sin? Was it a sin for me to do this? You know what Paul is saying? It was. You made me sin because you were so selfish. You were so greedy. I couldn't even receive support. So I had to rob other churches to receive support while I served you. Paul is not complimenting the Corinthian church for making Paul serve free of charge. He's rebuking them for it. So some of you say, well, why don't you preachers do what Paul did? Preach full time. Why don't you be like Paul? You know what I say? Why don't you stop being like the Corinthian church and quit being so greedy and cause your pastor to have to receive support from other people? Do you see this? So here in the New Testament is quite clear by the Apostle Paul that he expected tithing to continue, except instead of giving to the Levites, who were ministers of the Old Covenant, give to the ministers of the gospel, who are ministers of the New Covenant.